I never believed in the old stories my grandmother used to tell me, especially the ones about Jasy Jatere. Growing up in the city, they seemed like nothing more than myths designed to scare children into behaving. But that was before I spent the summer at my cousin's house in the rural Paraguayan countryside. The trip was meant to be a break from my usual life, a chance to reconnect with my roots and spend time with family. My cousin Diego and I spent most of our days outside, exploring the vast fields and dense woods that surrounded their home. It was peaceful, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But then, on one particularly hot afternoon, Diego mentioned the one rule his family strictly followed: never stay outside during siesta time. I laughed it off at first. After all, why would I waste a beautiful afternoon sleeping indoors? Diego wasn't laughing, though. "It's not just a nap," he warned, his voice serious. "It's because of him." "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Jasy Jatere," Diego whispered, his eyes scanning the edge of the woods. "The one who comes for those who don't respect the siesta. He's real, you know." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. But part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than I had thought. The next day was sweltering. The heat hung thick in the air, pressing down like a heavy blanket. After lunch, my aunt and uncle retreated to their rooms for the traditional afternoon siesta, and Diego followed suit. But I wasn't tired. The idea of lying in bed for hours when the day was so bright felt ridiculous. So, while everyone slept, I slipped outside, determined to make the most of the afternoon. The air was still, the only sound the distant chirping of cicadas as I wandered toward the woods. The trees were inviting, casting long, cool shadows that offered a reprieve from the oppressive heat. I sat down under a tree and closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet. That's when I heard it, the soft, haunting sound of a whistle. I opened my eyes, frowning. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't coming from the house. The whistle was coming from deep within the woods. It was slow, melodic, almost hypnotic, and despite my better judgment, I felt drawn to it. Standing up, I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush as the trees grew thicker around me. The deeper I went, the louder the whistle became, as if it was calling me, beckoning me closer. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to find the source. As I ventured further into the woods, the shadows grew darker, the air colder. The whistle never stopped, its eerie melody winding through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, and though I wanted to turn back, my legs kept moving forward, almost as if they were no longer my own. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and there, standing in the middle, was a boy. He was no older than 8, with long, blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. He held a small wooden staff, and around his neck was a woven necklace of dried leaves. His lips were pursed, whistling that same haunting tune. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was something wrong about him, his eyes were too intense, too knowing for a child. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said, his voice soft but firm. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air around me felt heavy, like something unseen was watching us from the trees. My skin prickled, and I realized, with growing dread, that this wasn't just a boy. It was him, Jasy Jatere. The stories came flooding back. The god of the siesta, who lured children and the unwary into the woods during the forbidden hours, taking them away if they disobeyed. Those who were taken were never seen again, or worse, they returned, but changed. I tried to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "You didn't listen," the boy whispered, taking a step closer. "It's siesta. You broke the rule." His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt a cold terror seize me. The whistle began again, but this time it wasn't coming from his lips. It was coming from all around me, echoing through the trees. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and I realized I was surrounded. Shadowy figures began to emerge from the woods, half-seen forms that flitted between the trees. My heart raced as the figures closed in. They looked human, but something about them was wrong, twisted, hollow, like they were barely alive. Their eyes were empty, glazed over, as they moved toward me with jerky, unnatural motions. Panic surged through me, and finally, I found the strength to run. I turned and bolted through the woods, my legs pumping as fast as they could. But the whistle followed me, growing louder, sharper. The figures moved with inhuman speed, darting through the trees, always just behind me. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating, as I sprinted back toward the house. My lungs burned, and my vision blurred as I burst through the tree line, stumbling into the yard. The whistle stopped abruptly, the oppressive silence returning in its place. I collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. When I finally made it back into the house, everyone was awake from their siesta. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. My aunt and uncle gave me strange looks, their faces pale. Diego pulled me aside later, his face grim. "You shouldn't have gone into the woods. People who see him, they're never the same." I wanted to argue, to say it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something had changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness outside my window felt alive, as if the woods themselves were watching, waiting. The next morning, I woke up with something cold in my hand. I looked down and saw it, a small wooden staff, just like the one the boy had carried. And that's when I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. The whistle. It was coming from the woods. And it was getting closer.